welcome to the MessianTics podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now, here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
Hey guys, thanks for joining us for another episode of the MessianTics podcast. In this episode, we are going to answer another question from our audience, and that question is this. Scriptural roles or duties of men in the congregation versus what actually happens in a congregation. Not just that of an elder or a deacon, but of the regular members. Should he also be able to teach or preach if called upon, work in kids ministries, be called on to serve in other capacities, or can he just show up and do nothing? The question is posed from a perspective of this individual having observed in previous congregations and maybe even in their current congregation of a tendency where most of the workload inside of a congregation is done by the women of the congregation rather than the men. Like, you may have a men on stage as preachers or pastors or what have you, but is there more that men could do besides just warming a chair and writing a check or what have you for their tithes and offering? And I think, oddly enough, especially in modern culture, at least, and I can say speaking specifically to like the West, in modern culture, I think we see the same tendency not just in the congregation but in the home life too. That a lot of times men leave a lot of the work at home to the wife and what have you, and so I think that there is some sort of a correlation between the two to some degree. But I think it's a really interesting question, especially in the fact that you have a lot of women that volunteer to like teach in Shabbat school or Sunday school or what have you, and many other areas like hospitality and serving food and what have you. But what is the role of men in a congregation? Where should or can or shouldn't they serve? Is there more that men can do? And by the way, this question is coming from a man, not coming from a female trying to point fingers at men, but this is coming from a man who's saying, I have observed over the years far too many men that are perfectly happy warming a seat, breathing in the air, taking up space, but not actually serving and investing in the congregation beyond that. So I throw that question out, and let's see where the conversation goes.
Yeah, I think it's a double-edged sword, that question.
Yeah.
Just because men, especially the men who come to our congregations most of the time, are, in many cases, doing the right thing. They are trying to provide for their families, which means working 40-plus hours a week a lot of the time, sometimes multiple jobs. And so, a lot of the times it's not that they're incapable of doing things in our congregations, but they're already doing so much at home. And, it'd be like, because, if we're honest, the congregations, a lot of the jobs and things we have that could be done, a lot of those things are almost our part-time jobs, or at least require the amount of time that you would spend delivering, food, through one of the, through DoorDash or Grubhub or whatever, so that they take time, they take energy. Some of them take money, and men, in many ways are already pressed on either side, a lot. And so they just can't, so again, sometimes it's not due to that they are incapable, that they don't know how to do the things or are incapable of being trained to do the things. They just are in between a rock and a hard place, trying to, find the availability where they feel that they're actually contributing something and actually being useful. Because I know as a man, if I walk away from something and felt like I have not been able to contribute to the thing, like if I go to a meeting and I'm not able to be useful, offer a good idea or something that's going to benefit the congregation or community as a whole, I walk away feeling like, why am I here? That someone else could fill this role, someone more, efficient, someone with better capabilities than I should be here. And so I have no doubt that sentiment is shared, I'm sure, by the male of the species, grand total. And I think ministry sometimes, too, we paint service in ministry as something that's lofty. We make it, what do you have a calling? And I know you have a particular opinion about, calling it that, not referring it to so much as a calling, something that God reaches down and, and it's not that, everything. It was a few years ago, Rabbi Eric had done a thing on this where he was like, he prefers to call it, an opportunity. God gives gifts, and then God gives us opportunities to use those gifts or not. And so, because if you make it into this thing where it's a calling, a lot of folks struggle with, if God doesn't reach down from heaven and tap me on the head or speak to me directly, then I'm confused as if I'm supposed to be here or not, or to step into this role. Whereas a lot of times, it is an opportunity. God gives you a gift to teach. God gives you a gift to lead and to worship, to lead a community. And then he gives you the opportunities, the doors to step into, to lead a flock, or to not even to lead a flock, but to help with the support of that community, that flock. And so sometimes when we talk about ministry in a way that makes it seem greater than it is, because ministry is not greater than it is, it's service. It's service in prayer, it's service in time, it's service in energy, and it can make it seem like, if I only have 2 hours a week I can give, that must not be a calling, so I shouldn't do that because God really hasn't called me to that. That's just a quick opportunity to do something, and I don't think if God hasn't called me to that, I can't do it. And so I think sometimes the way we talk about ministry, I think, makes men who especially desire to be useful turn away and lean away from opportunities because we make it seem like something it's not.
I'm assuming too that, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I've looked them up before, and I try not to put all of my chips onto certain statistics and stuff because you read one statistic and it's like, well, you need to look at it from this angle, look at it from that angle. But if I'm not mistaken, the majority of people that are in churches and synagogues, it's overwhelmingly female, if I'm not mistaken, whether it's memberships and just attendees. I'm not even talking about people in service.
Yeah, particularly in synagogues and Protestant circles. Yeah, it's overwhelmingly women.
It's difficult to talk about because I am a person who has both complementarian and egalitarian views of men and women in their roles, because I think that they can definitely overlap. I'm not known for my macho bravado, there are times I don't come home and expect that my wife has made dinner or anything like that. In fact, there are times when I cook. There are times when I do laundry. I certainly help her clean the house. There are things I do. Sometimes it is lopsided because I'm away more, just the time aspect of it. She's home more than me. But the reason why I'm trying to approach this carefully is because I don't want to come off as though I am putting forth a painting with a wide brush, like this is my view of men and women. I've seen men and women struggle in the same areas. I will say I've seen men more in the congregational setting struggle with being passive than women. And I don't criticize women for not being passive. I'm like, no, keep doing what you're doing. Why do I see so many men standing in the back of the synagogue with their hands in their pockets? So it bothers me. I'm not saying I have any one solution. I do think it's interesting if you go back to the original sin that Adam was passive. Now, there's the age-old fun argument of, Eve was deceived, and he was standing there with her.
That woman you gave me.
Right. Well, he was passive when it was happening, and then when it went south, he deflected.
Yeah.
So yes, Adam and Eve were both deceived, but when I look at Eve's approach, she was deceived because she was engaging the serpent, and Adam was simply silent. The passivity. And I do think that I have seen that kind of thing in synagogue and in church life, which is just, it used to bother me. I'm like, I want to say to some of these guys, God has so much more for you, and you're just standing in the back with your hands in your pockets, or you got a cup of coffee in the lobby. You won't even come in the sanctuary. You just spend all your time, and that, and I don't like the stereotypes. I don't like that women are that at times women are stereotyped as being busybodies when honestly, in many cases, I would see guys just hanging out, and not, I think, taking spiritual responsibility. But when I look at, again, I think it is important to always go back. I used to think that, Genesis is just a bunch of this, that, and the other. No, I think if you go back to what was happening in that garden, you see such a framework of where we are now. You see such a framework, and I think that you see beautiful things like God's intention for mankind, which was to dwell with us with unhindered, unlimited fellowship. So we know that's God's intention, right? But we also see how Satan works. And we also say, this is amazing because you don't always see, Satan's not always in the Bible. He shows up at different times, and I think it's very important to pay attention to how he speaks and what he does and how he tries to kind of dig and get in. And interestingly enough, he attacked Adam after he got married. So that's an interesting thing. But I think the very interesting thing is, I don't want to go too far about what I said before I pass the mic over, but I just find it's really kind of more of a, I'm throwing this out there for you guys to discuss. Just, I find it interesting that Adam's original sin manifested in being passive while his wife was engaging with the adversary.
I think for me, to some degree, you hit a really interesting note there, Rabbi Toby, dealing with Adam being passive and Eve's failure with the fruit. And I think most of us, if not all of us at the table, will agree. And I might be a little hyperbolic on the statement. I think that really the first sin was Adam not being the man of his household, not being the spiritual covering, not protecting his wife, not so much Eve eating the fruit. I think Eve caught the bad rap because she ate the fruit, but still, Adam was right there. He didn't do anything to stop it, and he could have. And then instead of taking ownership of that in front of God, he still put it all on her. Yeah, this woman you gave me, yada, 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 right? I think it's interesting that you bring up the note that especially in Messianic congregations, I see this, and it is probably likely also true in most of evangelical churches as well, that there is definitely a higher ratio of women in a congregation than men. I mean, we see this in our own congregation. We have a number of people, of ladies that have come over the years who are married, but their husband doesn't come with them. Their husband doesn't go anywhere. They come to service. The wife comes to service and is just praying for the day when their husband shows up. Right. Wow. I think it's a definitely a big issue. With that, I think it all ties into, or at least in my perspective, I think it all ties into the idea of, Paul deals with, says, women, wives, submit to your husbands, husbands, love your bride as Messiah, love the body. I think the roles should be in a way where the husband is the spiritual leadership, the spiritual authority, the spiritual head of the home, and is leading the family in the way that they should interact and worship, right? So like you were saying, women are up with their hands raised and worshiping, yeah. They're singing along, and the men are either standing with their hands in their pocket or they're sitting in the back with their cup of coffee, not doing.
Absolutely.
I think that the husband should be leading the charge of their family into the presence of God. And whether that's and I think we need to, I don't know that we can truly define what is service in terms of like what is the role that someone should play in a congregation, because not everybody's going to have a titled role, and not everybody's going to be in a position where they're actively involved in some like directive of ministry, whether it's Shabbat school or youth group or worship team or chazanim or what have you, right? Not everybody's going to be involved in something direct like that, and some are just going to be behind the scenes type of stuff. But I think that it starts before we try plugging people into roles just to fill roles. Mm-hmm. I think it starts with, is the congregation leading the husband to be the spiritual head that leads the charge for the family's spiritual life? And then in turn, is the husband actually picking up that mantle and doing it? Mm-hmm. And then from there, we will, I think, begin to see some of the shift where men get a little more involved. And I agree with you, John, that there's legitimately only so many hours in a day and so many days in a week. But I think especially with Messianic Judaism, where so many congregational leaders are bivocational, I think the "I already do so much during the week" argument kind of falls flat at least in the Messianic community, and still in the church world too, because a lot of pastors in the church world are bivocational.
And most, yeah.
It's a really hard sell to the congregational leader who also works outside the congregation to say, "Look, I work really hard to provide for my family, so I don't have time for this," while expecting the shepherd of the congregation, who's also working hard outside of the congregation to provide for their family, to literally toe the rope for everybody. So I think that's a bit exaggerated. I think to some degree, I mean, not that you meant it that way, but I do think it's that argument kind of falls flat sometimes. I am very, very, very good at making excuses for why I don't want to do something. That doesn't take a lot of effort for me, and I can come up with 1,000 excuses why I don't want to do something. But when it comes to being involved in the community that God has planted us in, like, I think, especially at CMC, we're intentional on the community aspect, on building a community, on building a mishpacha, a family. And in order for a family to be successful, as a family, everybody has to be involved. Everybody has to be playing a part and working together and building each other up and so on. And so I think, one, it starts, again, with the men doing what they're supposed to do for their families as the spiritual head of the family, right? Okay, great. You get a paycheck and you put food on the table and you make sure there's a roof, but are you leading them spiritually? Because that's the most important factor. And then from there, I think it all kind of flows in how they serve and interact in the congregation.
And I just, to Rabbi David's point, is if you look not just at Genesis, look at the patriarchs. Abraham, how passive he was when all that mess was going on with Sarah and Hagar. Isaac was passive, and Rebecca was able to and Jacob was passive with all that mess that was going on in their family. David was an incredible king and administrator. He never scolded his children when they were going nuts. So these are great men that we look up to that fell prey to that same kind of issue. For all we know, that if David wasn't a king, he would just be some deadbeat dad. You know what I'm saying? You guys know I love King David. I'm just saying the Bible is very clear in two different points and David never rebuked his children.
Right.
So, I see that. I look at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I look at a guy like David, and I'm like, it seems that the enemy loves to attack men with this, just this passive, hands in the pockets thing when it comes to certain things.
Right.
You know, and I think that is, I think, a bit of an epidemic. And again, I'm not criticizing women because, and I remember saying to Brooke a while back, said women just need to keep doing what they're doing in general because they're doing. I said I just think men are struggling with a deficiency in taking initiative spiritually in spiritual matters. I'm not going to run up to a guy in the synagogue who's standing in the back and wrap a talit around his neck and make him take. But I can tell you for a fact that I know there have been times when I've given a man a talit over the years because part of me kind of hopes that they'll embrace.
Sure.
You know, not that I'm coming down from some place of moral superiority, but it's kind of like, look at what's available to you. Like, step up and like embrace that.
It's not a passive faith. It's not a faith that allows for passivity. And I may get in trouble for saying this, but I think, but I think a lot of times, and we draw that again. This partially comes because we're so closely tied to, particularly those of us in America, we're so particularly tied to the evangelical Christianity, which has existed, since the 50s and 60s in the U.S. largely. There is this it's the very emotive part of the faith, where there has to be an emotional response. There have to be, these if you're not emotionally responding to the music, are you really worshiping? Are you really? And that appeals greatly to women. Women love that. Men don't most, and again, I'm not talking about every man, but most men are just like, I'm not really trying to like touch on to my feminine side or into my feelings, or
right.
I'm not trying to cry because if you read the Psalms, the things that were songs that were written for worship, most of them are very like stand up for the Lord and declare His glory and greatness. Yeah, these are not
across as fight songs.
Oh yeah, they're songs of war. They're not these like, I embrace and hug you, Lord, is my lover. It's like God is not your boyfriend. Like God is a king. He is Lord. He's the ruler and creator of all things. So I think for a lot of men too, there's this. I think in a lot of ways, men just sometimes don't get what Western spirituality has laid on the table in front of them. Mm-hmm. And so for us, it's kind of hard to figure out, like, what if I'm supposed to be, I worship, God is, the Lord is a man of war, it's written in mm-hmm. Scripture, and how do I prepare for war while singing songs about, being like solely this emotional creature, and it's because men like reason, men like logic, men like the idea of God saying stand up and fight for your family, fight for your faith, and not necessarily picking up a sword to do it, but you need to stand and fast and pray and and
I'm not disagreeing, and I don't want to disagree with you, like, because I think all that's true,
right?
I just think that. But it's also, and it's so funny you're touching on things that I listened to when I listened to that Mars Hill podcast about Mars Hill, because they really pushed a macho bravado.
I'm not even talking about that. Cause that's
no, I know you're not. I'm just saying that's what happens when it goes toxic is what I'm saying. Because I think that
there's a balance.
There is a balance, and I think that's the point, is like there's the man of war, but then there's also I'm gentle and humble in heart, and there's stand up and fight, and then there's also I care for a broken reed.
Right.
And I think that sometimes and you touched on that, and I think that that's true. I think that some men are just like, I'm not going to get all emotional. I don't want to hug somebody. And I'm like, yeah, but sometimes, I don't know.
Yeah, and I like reading about people who've lived long before I do. I love history, for those of you who know me well. And you read about, for whatever people think about monastics is whatever, but you read about monastics, people who are willing to live in a community a little bit separate from women and children in order to study, to pray, to be men of good faith, whatever disagreements I may have with their own personal interpretations of Scripture. They become these incredibly gentle men with all forms of life, but are also men capable of wielding a sword.
Yeah, authority.
Capable of wielding, authority and weapons. And I'm like, I think most men could embrace that. Mm-hmm. Could embrace this idea of, I am to my children the most gentle and loving person, but also the one with the most discipline. And maybe I'm probably guilty of not promoting that enough, of promoting spiritual discipline in a man's life. And I'm not just talking about like, oh, I didn't sin this week, but I'm talking about like, what good did you do? Like not just I avoided things, but what did I embrace? Right. What did I pray about and for? What did I fast about and for? What did I meditate on and for? Because a lot of the times, and this is, I think, more our trap, because so much of our faith involves the Torah and involves there are do's and do nots, and there's a lot of do nots that we get sometimes so wrapped up in the do's and do nots that we forget what are we called to be beyond those. That's the starting line, and sometimes I think a lot of men just haven't even started the race. I think we've never actually given men a racetrack to follow. We've never actually given them a map on how to read and interpret where they're going and how to get there. Because we have boiled it down to say this prayer, you get to heaven. It's like, that's not what this is about. This is people talk about, it's about relationship, not religion. Yes, it is about relationship. However, that relationship involves an actual relationship. It's not just the music. It's not just the services. What are you embracing? What aspects of God are you chasing after during the day, outside of service, outside of the high holy days? Are those the only times in which you feel that you're at the top of the mountain worshiping God? Those should be the times when you're definitely communally at the top of the mountain, but are those the only times? Or are you constantly after that peak? Are you constantly after chasing those aspects of God's character, of trying to be like Him? Because that's the whole purpose of all of this is to be like God, not like Him, like Satan wanted to be like Him, but like to have His character, to have His heart. That's why the Torah exists. The Torah shows us this is what God's heart is after, and when we lose track of that, that's when we feel passive. That's when you have the prophets showing up to the Israelites in its history going, you're doing all the sacrifices, you're doing all the feasts, and yet here are all of the people you should be caring for that are not cared for. And that's just one aspect of the Torah that they were failing to do. There were multiple more, and that's when God's like, I don't care for any of this if you're not going to do it the way I want you to do it with me, not just because, oh yeah, we have to do that thing because we're Israelites.
Yeah, it's not just checking off a list.
Exactly. And that's what we don't want Messianic Judaism to be, is we don't want people to feel like, oh, I just have to check off I went to Shabbat this week, I avoided the shrimp and the pork, I didn't celebrate Easter or Christmas, but I celebrated Sukkot. It's like, that's great. You should do all of that. And it's sort of like, when Yeshua's talking about those who are giving much and abundance to the temple and in the pots, he's saying, those of you who focus on tithing, mint and cumin and dill, these you should have done also. However,
right, you
should have first done the thing that was required, the heart of which was required as well. And so I think, and I don't know, this conversation kind of has me doing some self-reflection on, like, maybe there's possibly more that I have that I can give to the men of our community, direction, in sense of who are you to be outside of the walls of synagogue, because and maybe I'm selling myself short, but I only have so much reach, and so part of me, maybe I need to figure out how can I reach better when you're in my, a bucket of fish or a barrel of fish. When I have you in the barrel, how can I get you, before I let you out again, to make sure that you are feeling useful and that you actually can do it, not that you can't, or that there's no place for you to be involved.
I'll tell you one area I think that more men need to step up in, and that's in discipleship, particularly, which is a lot of what you're talking about, particularly in discipling young men in the congregation. Like, I think in a lot of ways, we have this notion that because we have Shabbat school or Sunday school, we have teens programs, we have, maybe young adults programs, whatever. We're like, okay, the congregation is handling that, and that's great. They're getting everything they need from there, but there's not a lot of involvement in the day-to-day life of what does it look like to live like Yeshua, to live for Yeshua, to live like Yeshua in a day-to-day life, especially for young men. Women are really good at that. Like, even if they're not trying to, they're doing it. And women take other young ladies under their care and it's almost natural. Men, we're cool with, like, taking a dude out to the golf course or the gun range or something like that. And but there needs to be more of that intentionality in discipleship, one-on-one, sowing the life lessons, spiritual lessons that we've learned into the lives of the young men in the congregation, rather than just leaving it up to everybody else. And I'll tell you, I think it's funny to me that I've watched over the years a lot of the same men that will complain about the youth of this day. Whether it was boomer generation complaining about the Gen X or millennial or alphas or whatever, or Gen X complaining about every, or millennials complaining. It doesn't. What's funny is they'll all complain about the youth of the day while not sowing anything into the spiritual life of the youth of the day. Yeah. And what do you end up with? The youth of the day doing what the youth of the day is going to do when nobody is sowing into their spiritual life. And so when we complain about all of the things that young people do or don't do that we aren't happy with, rather than going, hey, can I take you out to get a bite to eat sometime? I just want to sit down and chat. Let's just get to know each other, build a relationship. Maybe there's something. I love the apprenticeship idea in like trade skills. You can apprentice to be a plumber, you can apprentice to be a carpenter, you can apprentice to be a welder, what have you. I love that idea because you're taking, as a quote unquote expert, you're taking all of the years of training and lessons and hard fought life lessons, when something didn't go the way you were trained it was supposed to go and you had to figure out how to make it work anyways. You're taking all of the lessons you learned that were taught to you and all of the lessons you've learned solely through experience, and you're sowing that into other people. Being a rabbinic intern and serving a bunch of different congregations over the years, that was one of the things that I really appreciated in terms of my ministry, is that there were a lot of lessons I didn't have to learn the hard way because I was able to learn about those lessons from the guys that already learned it the hard way. And then that left plenty of hard lessons for me to still learn, but I wasn't going through the same cycles over and over again that everybody else was, because there was that kind of discipleship, mentorship mindset that went into it. And I think that same idea should be a very valued part of the walk of a believer. I mean, we look at Yeshua, who walked hand in hand for 3 years with a very tight-knit group of people, and then sent them out to do the same thing with more people, who then sent them out to do the same thing with more people. And the way we create people that model their lives after their heroes of the faith are that the heroes of the faith actually invest the time into the lives that they want to see modeled. And again, that's not an end-all be-all that men can or should do in a congregation. And this conversation has nothing to do with whether or not women should do more or less in a congregation. The question that was given to us is specifically about men, so we're answering that question. But I think that this is an area, first and foremost, that needs to be addressed by men in the congregation. Yeah,
and to a degree, I have a small group of folks that, occasionally, usually once or twice a month if we can afford the time and I'm not, out sick or something. We meet after service on Shabbat and we talk about a character quality of Yeshua, an aspect of the Torah, an aspect of the Brit Chadashah, and we just hone in on that. And it's just something that I have experience with and I've studied, and I'm able to give to them, to pour into them. And it's several couples and there's a few single men in it as well. But these are folks that I just have made the time for, because they've expressed the desire to have that time, to have something more, something extra. And there's a lot of people, a lot of young men especially, that I think if you offered the invitation, if you offered the moment, the opportunity, would say yes to. Now and again, and I think here's where it has to be. Here's where it has to, we actually have to distinguish between a class and discipleship, because if it becomes something formal, like a class, like it's scheduled at this and this time, and show up if you want to be here, then it becomes impersonal, it becomes cold, something that folks are like, well, now again, you can do that with things like Hebrew and with thematic studies, because then it's just open to everybody. But discipleship it's personal. It's something that you have to, you are tying, and again, this comes back to that balance, as Toby and I were talking about earlier. You are tying heartstrings with these people. You are tying a relationship with this person. You are connecting. And so you do have to reach out to them. It can't just be like, oh, hi, we're having this thing later. Like, those of you who want to show up. It's like, hey, Joseph, I see you, growing and thriving here, in your what seems to be, your spiritual life, at least from the outside of what I can see. Come and let me give you something more, at least what I can offer you. And then, up until that point when I can't offer you anything more, and then we'll sit, move, and then help those people move on. Because they may have, they may have a gifting that needs to be exercised elsewhere, and maybe you're going to help them to step into that, role and go elsewhere. I know that, before I came here to Bradam, the community and the rabbi at Dothan Messianic, they certainly helped me to step into my giftings, and which ultimately ended up in me coming to Bradam and not staying at Dothan. So, again, and that'll be the other things. You can't be afraid of losing those people by helping them to become who ultimately, because again, they're not yours. They're God's. And so you were just helping them along the way to be closer and closer to God, to being more like God. And that's, but again, that personal invitation. Yeshua went up to his disciples and invited them. And when he invited many, that's often when he was met with excuses, like, oh, I've got dinner plans. Oh, I've got a field to plow, all these things, so, again, that's why, sometimes we wonder, those of us in ministry, why does no one ever show up to these things? Well, maybe it needs to be, you need to go up to them face to face, because then they're accountable. Then they actually have to look you in the eyes and say, no. It's not and rather than looking you in the eyes and say, oh my goodness, this person who is bi or trivocational, is actually inviting me into their time, into their life, to be part of it. Maybe there's something I can glean from that. Now, of course, if you're not living in a way that should be, in a way that's good, then, maybe they have a right to say no. But if you are living a life that shines that light of Messiah, you reflect the light of Messiah into the world, they'll see that. And, if you invite them in, if they desire God, they should say yes. And most of the time they do. And that's been the biggest thing I've learned within the last probably year and a half, is that people want it, but they want it. They want to be a part of it. They don't just want to be a number. They don't just want to be a classmate or someone occupying desk space. They actually want to be in and involved. And so, with men, especially those of you older men who can mentor, those of you who are able to disciple, invite men in, especially younger men. Younger men are hungry. I think it was, I forget his first name, but Mr. Rich at last year's Rabbis conference talked about, the no comment on that. But he gave actually what I thought was the best presentation of the entire conference. Was that young people, and again, this involves both men and women, but since we're speaking about men, they're hungry for faith, they're hungry for God, and they're hungry for those places and traditions which are going to give them and feed them. And so if we offer the opportunity to eat, they will come and they will eat. It's like a good potluck, serve it and they will come.
I think that one of the things that we need to really look at when we discuss this is that the Hebrew word for worship is avodah, which actually means to serve. And we as men oftentimes come to service to worship. So we sing the songs, we say the liturgy, we stand when we're supposed to, we sit when we're supposed to. But the aspect of serving not just God but man, serving those in our community, is not always looked at in the same way. We almost separate, I came to serve God. So there's not as much of the serving man aspect in it. It's interesting. Our synagogue is a little anomaly because we have almost as many men that come as we do women, and every week we get up on Saturday after Oneg and say, okay, we need some volunteers to take the trash out, and we always have volunteers. But it surprises me that in all the years we've been having service, we still have to ask people every week, we need volunteers to take the trash out, instead of people just saying, the trash is going to need to be taken out, I'm going to go do this.
Yeah.
Or, the dishes are going to need to be washed, or this is going to be taken, or the sheep droppings in the sanctuary are going to need to be picked up, or whatever. And
did you say sheet droppings? Sheep. Okay, that's what I thought I heard, and I was like, wait a second, what?
The sheep, the flock is in the sanctuary, and when they leave,
and they leave their crap behind. Yeah,
they leave the stuff there. and so everybody knows that it needs to be done, and people are willing to do it. But it's surprising that they don't just do it knowing it needs to be done. That they're need, and somehow when we say. When we start singing, you don't generally have to invite people to stand up to worship. They just do it. And when we do the liturgy, people just stand up to do it. And when the Torah comes out, people just stand up because they know that aspect of worship, what's expected is that they step up and do it.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the service part of worship, that part, they know it's got to be done. Everybody knows it needs to be done. But every week we have to say, hey, can I get 3 volunteers or 4 volunteers to do this? Or can I get some help for cleaning up the dishes or packing up the stuff or putting away? And somehow we have to transition from the looking for volunteers to people just volunteering. And I want to say, as we started this discussion about men being involved, which is what we're talking about, that it used to be, when I was a kid, men were the ones that worked outside the home and women worked in the home. And so you could say, well, men worked 50 or 60 hours a week. Their wives didn't, so there's an expectation the wife will pick up the slack at the synagogue or teaching the Shabbat school, their Sunday school, whatever. Nowadays, women are working just as much as men.
Everyone's working 50, 60 hours.
Yeah, and yet we still expect the women, somehow women can work 50, 60 hours and teach Shabbat school and lead this and do that and wash dishes. But men work 50, 60 hours and somehow we don't have the time to do those things. Somehow that just hasn't quite got there.
Culture shifts take a while.
Yeah, and so
especially when you're stubborn.
Right. So we have to change our viewpoint to where our avodah, our worship of God, includes service to our community, and it should be offered without having to be prompted.
Yeah.
When we praise God, it's offered without prompting, or should be. When we serve God, it should be that way. When we serve man, it should also be offered without prompting. It shouldn't be something that we have to say, okay, I need people to do this. But everybody knows that the garbage is there.
Yeah.
They see it in the can. They see the papers on the table. They see the cups that need to get thrown away. They see all the stuff that needs to be done. Somehow we have to change our heart to where we see that as worship also. That as part of serving God, because when we serve man, we are serving God.
Yeah, and that's the key, is worship isn't just raising your hands and singing with your voice. Right? I mean, bottom line, if you look at what the Torah calls avodah, the priesthood, it was sacrifices, it was sprinkling blood, it was lighting fires, it was
and the cleaning up
work.
And the preparation before and the cleaning up after is all part of it.
Yep, and the same with the Levites. The Levites' job was avodah. When they carried the ark, when they carried the altar, when they broke down and set up the tabernacle, it was all avodah. It was all service, but the difference is avodah is, and you hit on this, Rabbi Eric, avodah is not just doing something to do it. It's not doing a service because a service needs to be done. It's doing a service as a heart of worship. Right? So whether it's, and especially within a community, like in a congregational setting especially, whether it's getting up and bringing a message, which, by the way, to answer the original question to some degree, I think everybody, man, woman, doesn't matter. I think everybody should, in one way or another, be prepared to bring a word at any point in time. because you may get asked to cover Bible study. You may get asked, hey, you know what? I would love to hear, we both have done this in our congregation. I would just love to hear somebody in the congregation share what the Lord is speaking through them. Like, I'm not the only conduit of the voice of God. Rabbi Toby's not the only conduit of the voice of God. So yeah, I think everybody should be in one way or another prepared at all times to preach the good news. But the reality is, whether it's serving on the spiritual sense, like from the platform, from the bima, as a worship team member, worship leader, as a chazan, as a rabbi, or in Shabbat school, whatever there are these functional roles, right? Whether it's that, or it's service in the sense of taking out the trash, or service in the sense of pulling out jumper cables because somebody in the parking lot's car died, or whatever. Like, there's literally anything that we do as a community should be avodah. It should be an act of worship. And by the way, you'll stay out of a lot more trouble if you look at your life as avodah rather than looking at your life as opportunities from time to time to worship. If your focus is, I got to get from, I'm going to worship this Shabbat and I'm going to worship next Shabbat, but in between I'm just living, or I'm going to worship this Sunday and I'm going to worship next Sunday, and in between I'm just living. If you look at your entire life as avodah, as worship before the service-based worship before the Lord, guess what? You'll find yourself in a lot less trouble too, right? You'll have a lot less arguments. You'll have a lot less temptation that takes root in your life. You'll have a lot less. So yeah, the idea that, especially in the Western evangelical mindset, that worship is we're raising our voices and our hands and whatever. Yes, that is a part of it. There is a vocalization, a lifting of our voices before the Lord, but there's actually a service aspect to what worship is, and that concept of avodah.
That's why the scripture says, whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of Yeshua. Do all as unto God. And even when we talk about, just recently we read Parsha Korach, where the Korach, his job was to cover the implements, the temple tabernacle furniture, and he did not see that service in the form of worship in the same way that Aaron and Moses' job was worship. And so he wasn't satisfied with what his form of worship or his calling to worship was. When the reality is that if you're taking the trash out and you're doing it unto the Lord, it's just as important in worship, just as powerful a worship as singing a song or giving a message or whatever. We don't look at it that way, but we should.
Yeah. I think, and to continue with that same line of thought, in the ancient world, worship was, the acts of service, but also the idea of bringing something to God. And even the pagans understood this. They brought things to idols. They brought specifically food and incense. And we do the same. We bring God, we bring to the tabernacle, to the place of worship, meat, which was to become food, and incense, which was to be burned before God. And Yeshua expands that idea of worship to, he says, if you feed the least of these, if you clothe the least of these, is as if you brought clothing and food and washing to me. It's as if you did the same service to me, and so he expands that idea, again, hitting on his divinity as well, that you are worshiping me in bringing food to others, specifically the brethren, those who are in prisons, those who are downtrodden, those who belong to the faith, bringing them something to eat, making sure they're not naked, making sure that they are not without. So again, worship is so much more than, like Rabbi David said, it's so much more than just songs. It is.
So as we get ready to wrap up this episode, I think it's important that the men listening, and
hopefully they do,
that the men listening will look for opportunities to be of service rather than waiting to be instructed to do so. There's plenty of opportunities to do avodah, to do the physical things like taking out the trash or sweeping the floors, cleaning up, plunging the toilets, whatever. But there's also ministry avodah, doing prison ministry, doing homeless ministry, doing Bible studies, home instruction, taking a disciple under your wings, doing those kind of things, and sharing the message. or a study or something. So it's ministry and worship has to be active. And Rabbi Toby used the word description as passive versus active earlier. And I think it's important that we renounce passivity as men and step into the roles of worship and avodah and service in our communities. So I hope that you will. Thank you to whoever sent this message, this question into us. If you have questions you'd like us to talk about in a further episode, feel free to let us know by either our Facebook page, other social media, or put it on the link of whatever podcast format you're listening to.
Thank you for listening to the MessianTics podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.